It's the early 1990s, and arcades are buzzing with the sound of quarters dropping, joysticks clacking, and the electric hum of CRT screens. The gaming world is booming, and Capcom is at the forefront, pumping out hit after hit. But then, out of nowhere, they drop something darker, grittier, and unlike anything else in their lineup: The Punisher. Here's the thing, this wasn't another beat-em-up trying to cash in on a big name. This game was a blood-soaked dive into the world of Frank Castle, Marvel's infamous vigilante who just doesn't fight crime, he erases it. The Punisher took the gloves off, blending brutal combat, intense action, and the hard-edged tone of its comic roots into an experience that grabbed arcade players by the collar and didn't let go. Now, if you're into comic books or retro gaming, you know the Punisher isn't your friendly neighborhood superhero. He's not just here for justice, he's out there for revenge. A family tragedy turned him into one of the most feared anti-heroes in pop culture. And in 1993, Capcom decided to take a chance by throwing this violent, no-nonsense character straight into an arcade game. The result? A title that's often overlooked but deserves a much bigger spotlight. So grab your trench coat, lock and load, and let's uncover the story behind one of the most underrated Marvel games of the 90s. By 1993, Capcom was already riding high as one of the kings of the arcade. They'd built a reputation for creating some of the most iconic beat-em-ups the gaming world had ever seen, with titles like Final Fight and Captain Commando cementing their dominance. These games weren't just button mashers, they had personality, polish, and mechanics that drew players in and kept them hooked. It was a golden age for the genre, and Capcom wanted to push their momentum even further. That's when they turned their sights to The Punisher. Marvel Comics was no stranger to the video game adaptations of the early 90s, but let's be honest, most of them were hit or miss. For every Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin that nailed it, there were a handful of forgettable entries that barely scratched the surface of what these heroes were about. The Punisher, however, was different. Here was a character that wasn't colorful, cheery, or spouting one-liners while swinging from rooftops. Frank Castle was brutal, driven, and single-minded in his pursuit for revenge. Translating that into a video game wasn't going to be easy. The project landed in the hands of Capcom, a developer that, at the time, was unparalleled when it came to creating visually stunning, mechanically satisfying arcade games. The idea was to take the relentless, gritty action of the Punisher comics and bring them to life in a way that felt true to the source material, but also fun for arcade goers. This was a balancing act though. Marvel had its licensing standards to uphold, and while the Punisher's dark, violent narrative was his hallmark, Capcom couldn't just throw buckets of blood under the screen and call it a day. They needed to be creative. The game was developed using the same engine that powered Final Fight, but with significant upgrades. Capcom's team wanted the Punisher to feel familiar to beat-em-up fans while giving it a personality that was all of its own. The levels were designed to mimic the grimy urban environments of the comic series, alleys littered with debris, seedy nightclubs, and enemy hideouts that felt ripped straight from Frank Castle's war on crime. The enemy roster wasn't just a lineup of generic thugs either. It featured recognizable foes from the Punisher comics, including the ultimate showdown with the Kingpin himself. The result was a game that, while often overshadowed by Capcom's other titles, stood out for its boldness. It wasn't just another beat-em-up. It was a love letter to the Punisher fans and a testament to Capcom's knack for taking risks in a genre they had already mastered.
Great character. We wanted to utilize that as best as we could.
At its core, The Punisher is a classic beat-em-up, but don't let that fool you. It's packed with clever mechanics and design choices that set it apart. Capcom knew they couldn't just slap a trench coat on a Final Fight clone and call it a day. This game had to feel like The Punisher, and that meant embracing the character's gritty, no-holds-barred approach to combat. The foundation is familiar. Players move from left to right, smashing waves of enemies in a series of linear stages. But where the Punisher shines is in its attention to detail. Frank Castle isn't just throwing punches and kicks. He's taking down enemies with a full arsenal of weapons that make every brawl feel dynamic and chaotic. Unlike most beat-em-ups of the time, the Punisher introduces a robust weapon system that's seamlessly integrated into the action. Melee weapons like knives, pipes, and baseball bats are scattered throughout the levels, and they don't just feel like afterthoughts. Each weapon has a weight and impact, making it incredibly satisfying to bash an enemy across the screen with a steel pipe. But it doesn't stop there. Guns. Yes, actual firearms make their way into the mix, and this is a game that really leans into the spirits of the comics. In most beat-em-ups, ranged weapons are either rare or cumbersome to use, but in The Punisher, they are a natural extension of the gameplay. Frank Castle can whip out pistols, machine guns, or even grenades mid-combat, blasting enemies with brutal efficiency. It's a perfect fit for the character, and the developers balanced it well to ensure the game didn't devolve into a mindless shooting gallery. Ammo is limited, forcing players to be strategic about when to unleash their firepower, and enemies are often quick to close the distance, keeping the melee combat front and center. And the addition of Nick Fury as a second playable character brings another layer of depth. While the two characters play similarly at a base level, their subtle differences add variety, especially in co-op mode. Fury's animations and attacks have more of a militaristic flair, reflecting his background as a seasoned super spy. Together, Castle and Fury feel like a well-oiled machine, with co-op players being able to pull off coordinated attacks and cover each other in the thick of battle. Enemy variety is another area where the Punisher excels. You're not just fighting generic thugs on repeat. The game throws everything at you, from mobsters with crowbars to flamethrower-wielding maniacs. Boss fights, a hallmark of the genre, are where the game truly flexes its muscles. Each boss is designed to challenge players in unique ways, requiring quick reflexes and adaptability. Memorable standouts include Bruno Costa, the man responsible for Frank Castle's tragic origin, and, of course, the Kingpin himself, a hulking, near-unstoppable force that feels like the perfect final boss for the Punisher's crusade. The level design also deserves a shout-out. Capcom clearly put effort in making each stage feel distinct, both visually and mechanically. One moment, you're fighting through the grimy back alleys. The next, you're tearing through a luxurious penthouse or dodging hazards in an industrial lair. These environments aren't just backdrops. They're filled with destructible objects and interactive elements that make the whole world feel alive. Smashing crates to find weapons or tossing enemies into barrels isn't just satisfying, it adds a layer of strategy to the chaos. Ultimately, the Punisher takes the familiar formula of the beat-em-up genre and injects it with a dose of adrenaline that feels uniquely tailored to its source material. It's brutal, fast-paced, and endlessly satisfying. A game that captures the relentless nature of Frank Castle's war on crime while delivering some of the best gameplay the genre had to offer in the early 90s.
This game just feels really smooth and refined versus some of the other.
When The Punisher hit the arcades in 1993, it didn't arrive with the same fanfare as Capcom's juggernauts like Street Fighter II or Final Fight. It was a quieter release, but for those who played it, the experience left an impression. Critics and players alike recognize the quality of the game, but its legacy remains a strange mix of respect and obscurity. Let's start with the reception at the time. The game found a solid audience in arcades where the beat-em-up genre was still going strong. Players praised the intense action, tight controls, and brutal edge that made it stand out. The ability to wield firearms and mix melee combat with ranged attacks was something fresh, and it gave the game a tactical layer that most other beat-em-ups lacked. Co-op mode, as expected, was a major draw, with many players loving the dynamic between Frank Castle and Nick Fury. Critics appreciated the level of polish, especially with the visuals and sound, which were a step above many arcade games of that era. The grim tone and comic-inspired aesthetic were faithful to the Punisher's source material without feeling overly dark or alienating. Still, it didn't achieve the runaway success of Capcom's other franchises. Part of the reason may have been the timing. By 1993, the beat-em-up genre was extremely crowded, and one-on-one fighting games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II dominated the arcade scene. When the game made its way to the home console in 1994, specifically the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive, depending on where you were, it faced even more hurdles. The Genesis port, while competent, was significantly stripped down from the arcade original. Graphics were downgraded, enemy counts were reduced, and the co-op feature, one of the arcade's biggest strengths, was limited to alternating turns instead of simultaneous play. For fans of the arcade game, the home port felt like a pale shadow of the original, though it still had its charm for those who hadn't experienced it in arcades. Despite these challenges, the game's legacy has endured in surprising ways. Among fans of the beat-em-up genre, The Punisher is often held up as a hidden gem, a game that pushed the genre forward in subtle but meaningful ways. Its innovative weapon system, tight gameplay, and commitment to its source material sets a standard for how licensed games could be done right. For Marvel fans, it's a testament to an era when the game company was still experimenting with how to translate their heroes into video games.
Punisher then holds him by the ankles as the piranhas do their work, and he tells the piranha.
So here we are at the end of Frank Castle's pixelated warpath. For most of us, The Punisher wasn't just a game. It was a glorious, quarter-munching ode to revenge, justice, and the unrelenting joy of beating up bad guys into oblivion. It's the kind of game that reminds us why arcades were the ultimate proving grounds for gamers. No save points, no mercy, just raw, unfiltered action. And yet this masterpiece of mobster pummeling brilliance is still stuck in the dusty archives of gaming history, a victim of licensing red tape and the industry's love of moving on too fast. It's like the grizzled anti-hero it stars, misunderstood, overlooked, and just waiting for someone to dust it off and appreciate its gritty charm. Seriously, how has this game not gotten a re-release? We had 3 different remasters of Skyrim, but The Punisher can't get one? Come on, gaming industry, get your act together. If you haven't played it, find a way. Legally, of course. Wink, nudge, wink, nudge. Maybe you've got a vintage arcade nearby, or perhaps there's a Genesis copy floating around on eBay for the price of a small car. Either way, it's worth experiencing. And if you have played it, drop a comment below. What's your best Punisher memory? Did you and a buddy wreck shop as Frank and Fury? Or did you rage quit because Kingpin just wouldn't go down? If you enjoyed exploring the history and making of The Punisher, click this video here to see more from the Retro Reload. And, as always, thank you for watching.